According to a study that was published in the academic journal Science, there are few places on our planet that have not been touched by the human footprint. From Arctic tundra to primeval rainforest to arid desert, our natural world has been fragmented by ever-expanding towns and cities, crisscrossed with roads, transmission lines, and pipelines, and pockmarked by pump jacks, flare stacks, and other infrastructure used to drill, frack, and strip mine fossil fuels from the ground. The fact is that the need to supply food, fiber, fuels, shelter, and fresh water to more than 7 billion of us living on the planet is driving the wholesale conversion of forests, of wetlands, of grasslands, and of other ecosystems. For example, researchers have discovered that farmland and pasture now rivals natural forest in covering the planet. Some 40% of the land's surface is now covered in agriculture. And although advances in modern agriculture have brought millions of hectares of once unsuitable scrub land into food production, the environmental consequences of our growing food print have been severe in some regions, resulting in the loss of wildlife habitat, degraded water quality, and widespread soil erosion. Indeed, satellite images taken from hundreds of kilometers above the surface of the planet reveal a world that we have irrevocably changed in a very short period of time. The significance of human land use was brought into sharp relief recently with a series of maps that were published by a colleague of mine, Dr. Timothy Golden, a researcher at the University of Maryland's Center for International and Security Studies. Timothy, using data from the U.S. Defense Meteorological Science Program at NOAA, identified contiguous lighted areas across the planet. The bright spots that you see here reflect sources of light emissions, lit homes, powered factories, illuminated city streets, and largely urban infrastructure which now dominates the planet's surface. Golden's maps show how much of our planet is today under the direct influence of humans, particularly due to urbanization, but also the sprawling growth and spread of energy infrastructure and development in formerly intact areas such as Canada's boreal forest. Now, although industrial projects like the proposed Northern Enbridge Gateway Pipeline or the defeated megaquarry here in southern Ontario, they typically grab the public's attention and they generate public opposition. But I want to stress to you, it is most often the combined impacts of a range of human activities on the land base that threaten to drive nature beyond critical tipping points and that once are passed, results in species extinctions. For example, in my home province of British Columbia, forest, energy, and mineral leases and licenses are widespread and often multi-layered in the same areas. This is northeastern British Columbia. This is the next big energy boom in Canada, a place called the Peace region of northeastern BC. As various industries in the Peace region have exploited these tenures, a sprawling patchwork of large clear-cuts, oil wells, dams and reservoirs, fracking operations, and thousands upon thousands upon thousands of kilometers of seismic lines, roads, and pipelines have now come to dominate the landscape. The David Suzuki Foundations and our partners in the Indigenous communities have published the first ever spatial analysis of the land use pressures that are occurring within northeastern British Columbia. And I just wanted to share some of these results with you because they're quite alarming. We found, for example, that in the Peace region of northeastern BC, there are 16,000 oil and gas well sites, 8,000 petroleum and natural gas facilities in the region. There are 45,000 kilometers of roads, paved highways, resource roads, local roads, 1,000 kilometers of transmission lines, 28,000 kilometers of oil and gas pipelines. 3/4 of these pipelines are still in operation. In fact, more than half of all the pipelines found in British Columbia are found within this tiny area of the Daneza Nation, which is in northeastern BC. If you placed all the pipelines, roads, and seismic lines in the region and laid them out end to end, they would extend almost 4.5 times around the surface of the planet. The aggregate human footprint in this area of Canada is absolutely massive, and it's growing at an unprecedented rate. In fact, the pace and scale of growth and development in northeastern BC exceeds other intensively managed areas on the planet, including the oil sands. this is actually worse than the oil sands because it's a death by 1,000 cuts. It's not one or two major large projects. It's the cumulative aggregate of tens of thousands of industrial developments that are happening within a very small area. In fact, over 65% of northeastern BC has now felt the impact of industrial development, leaving little intact habitat for sensitive and endangered species such as caribou to feed, breed, or roam. Degradation and destruction of habitat for species at risk, such as caribou, has resulted in the situation where these animals are no longer self-sustaining and their populations are spiraling towards extinction. First Nations, who have relied on caribou as their primary source of food for thousands of years, can no longer hunt them. This is a clear violation of their treaty rights. Now, we must remember that this dire situation in northeastern BC, and it's replicated throughout Canada, did not happen by accident or because of a laissez-faire approach to how we manage our economy, resource, and land management. Numerous industries in the area are operating legally and according to the rules and regulations that are set by our provincial and federal government. But the reality is that the problem lies in laws about land, resource, and water management. Our laws in Canada are hardwired to fail communities and the environment. The narrow focus of our laws enables industries to operate in isolation from one another. For example, in my home province of BC, we have numerous individual laws: the Forest Range and Practices Act, the Oil and Gas Activities Act, the Mines Act, alongside the regulated industries that they enable. But my province, like every jurisdiction in Canada, lacks a legal framework to proactively and comprehensively manage the aggregate cumulative impact of multiple resource industries operating within the same area. And this is one of the reasons why the David Suzuki Foundation and our First Nations partners are engaged in a multi-year effort to reform our laws and regulations in terms of how we oversee growth and development in Northern Canada. A cumulative impacts approach, that's the alternative, to governing resource development would upend the current way in which we manage resource development in Canada. It would focus on the management of the needs of the land, the water, the air, the wildlife, and communities that depend on them first, rather than the resources that we extract from them. In practical terms, it would mean that rather than focusing on what to take from nature to create wealth and employment, we would first consider what must be retained in nature to sustain both wildlife and the well-being of local communities: clean air, clean water, and healthy food to eat. At a recent symposium on managing the cumulative impacts of industrial development in Canada, numerous speakers, from First Nations to academics to business leaders, stressed that effectively managing cumulative impacts will require totally new institutions, new governance mechanisms, perhaps even new legal tools. More importantly, and I want to stress this, it will require our leaders to adopt a more proactive and holistic way of thinking about our planet. One that recognizes that far from being just a place to extract resources and fossil fuels, timber, and minerals, nature is our home, as the leader of Bhutan has told us. Nature provides our most fundamental needs and dictates limits to growth, so its protection should be our #1 priority. Managing our massive growing human footprint on this planet more sustainably will require leadership. And much of that leadership is found in our First Nations, especially our First Nations youth. They are on the front lines of the day-to-day realities of cumulative environmental change. In 2010, First Nations across Northern Canada traveled to Victoria, the seat of the British Columbia government, to deliver a joint declaration to the BC government. They demanded that the cumulative impacts of industrial development be looked at before any new large infrastructure projects proceed, such as a plan that would see a third mega dam established on the Peace River at a place called Site C. Speaking to reporters, Treaty Chief Liz Logan said in reference to industrial development, "We have become the cash register for this government and this province. Now our way of life is going to be interfered with again. We are bush people. The land is our grocery store, our pharmacy, our school, and our church. It still sustains us." The position of the First Nations of Northern Canada is corroborated by scientific study after scientific study, including by our own regulatory processes like environmental assessment. I want to quote from you from the most recent joint review panel that was done that looked at this massive infrastructure project called the Site C Dam. This is the most expensive infrastructure project in Canada at $12 billion. It concluded, quote, "The Peace River region, the traditional territories of the Daneza people, has been and is currently undergoing enormous stress from resource development. In this context, the panel has determined that the project, combined with past, present, and reasonably foreseeable future projects, result in significant cumulative impacts on fish, vegetation, ecological communities, wildlife habitat, as well as the current use of lands and resources by Aboriginal people for their heritage." Local First Nations have gone further. They believe that if mega projects like the Site C Dam are built, it would infringe on their treaty and Aboriginal rights if they are no longer able to hunt, fish, gather medicinal plants, and participate in a sustained and meaningful way in traditional activities as they have done for thousands of years before they entered into treaty with the Crown. 7 different First Nations throughout northeastern British Columbia and downstream of the Peace River in Alberta have now launched major court challenges to stop major infrastructure projects such as the Site C Dam from proceeding within their traditional territories, citing an abrogation of treaty and Aboriginal rights, including cumulative impacts upon them. So to conclude, I believe that we must look at the big picture rather than individual elements in isolation when we make decisions that could degrade or destroy our natural world and upend the lives and livelihoods of Indigenous people. Although we don't give it much thought, forests, rivers, grasslands, wetlands, and other ecosystems provide an astonishing suite of natural benefits, so-called natural capital. Trees clean our air, wetlands filter our water, forests remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, thereby acting as a hedge against runaway climate change. And this doesn't even account for the health and psychological benefits, as well as the spiritual benefits that we get from spending time as nature. As biological creatures, we depend on the natural world and the ecological services sustain the health and well-being of our families and our communities. But too often, the natural capital benefits of our lands and territories are treated as if they have no value by our policymakers, even though this brings great and dire impacts on communities, particularly Indigenous people. So I have a proposal. We need to abandon our antiquated models of growth and development. We need to protect natural capital. We need to honor and our obligations to Aboriginal people, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. And that includes our obligations under UN Charter for the Indigenous Rights of Peoples, which includes the right to free, prior, and informed consent, which Canada is a signatory to. We need to reform our regulatory process to address and prevent cumulative impacts development before they happen. Thank you.